In video segment number 2 of module number 1, I want to look more closely at vowels and diphthongs and punctuation as well as pronunciation rules that accompany our first segment to fill out, if you will, some understanding around the Greek alphabet. And so first and foremost, let's look at the way vowels function in the Greek New Testament. You will notice as you have memorized the Greek alphabet that you've got 7 vowels in the Greek vowel system. You've got the alpha, the epsilon, the eta, the iota, the omicron, the upsilon, and the omega. All right. And as I mentioned as we walk throughout the Greek alphabet, some of these have short sounds, some of them have long sounds, some of them have both. And so just by way of understanding, let's touch on each of these. The eta and the omega are always long. A, O is how we pronounce those two respectively. The epsilon and the omicron are always considered short. Ah is the way we go with those. And then your alpha, your iota, and your upsilon really can go either way. All right? Ah, and in this case, oo. Again, the intonation being more about length of time spent in pronouncing them as opposed to specific kinds of sounds. But that gives you an orientation to the way these particular vowels functioned in the Greek system. Now, in addition to working with vowels, you'll notice that you can create something else by putting 2 vowels together. In English as well as in Greek, that's what we called a diphthong. And what are these diphthongs? Well, they're 2 different vowels side by side that are pronounced with a single sound. Okay? As we move into the Greek system, you'll find that there are 7 common diphthongs. Right, let's look at each of those. As we pull these up, notice the first one that we come across is the combination of the alpha and the iota into the alpha-iota diphthong. Okay? When these 2 come together, it gives you the pronunciation of the word I in English, similar to the same diphthong in English in the word for aisle. Moving along, the epsilon and the iota coming together to form the epsilon-iota diphthong. Here, when those 2 come together, taking the pronunciation of an A sound, as in the English word for 8. Okay? Another diphthong, the omicron and the iota, forming the omicron-iota diphthong. When these 2 come together, they form the sound oi in English, as in the English word for boy. Notice that you've got a good correspondence there because the OI in English also makes that same sound. It's because it's the same diphthong in English. The next one is the upsilon-iota diphthong, making the sound of a wee, if you will, as in the word for queen. There's a W-E-E that pushes this particular one through. You'll find this particular diphthong at the beginning of a word for the Greek word sun. And you really see the W come together there in the word for huios. And so whenever you have your upsilon and your iota diphthong in the Greek, it takes that kind of hui sound corresponding to the English word for queen. Now, the next one that we'll find is called the alpha-upsilon diphthong. Okay? This is pronounced with an OW sound in English, like you have in the English word for owl. It's an ow sound. In addition, the epsilon-upsilon diphthong, pronounced with a U sound, if you will, like you have in the English word for feud. And then the 7th and final diphthong being the omicron-upsilon diphthong, here taking the pronunciation of an oo sound, like you have in the English word for boot. Now, before we leave this screen, let me just point out some things that may help in terms of not only pronunciation, but also recognition. Notice that when you're working with the 7 different diphthongs in Greek, you have 4 diphthongs with an iota as the second letter. You have 3 diphthongs with the upsilon as the second letter. And so that can be helpful as you keep these clear in the mind that 4 of them are going to end in iota, 3 of them are going to end in upsilon. Notice also that many of these diphthongs in Greek correspond to diphthongs in English. We already saw the alpha iota diphthong, corresponding to the English word for isle. The epsilon iota diphthong would correspond to the English word for freight. The omicron iota diphthong would correspond to the English word for boil. Okay? And so we see these kinds of things working throughout the diphthong list. The alpha upsilon diphthong corresponding to the word for kraut. All right? You see that the epsilon upsilon corresponds to the EU sound in English with feud. And then the omicron upsilon with the boot in that sense, which is a little bit different. But these are all sounds that we're familiar with. And take that familiarity as you begin to put these to memory within the context of the Greek system. Now, there are also what we call improper diphthongs in Greek. Whenever long vowels come into contact with an iota, an improper diphthong is created with the addition of what is called an iota subscript, okay? Now, these are long vowels. And so whenever those try to merge with a particular iota, they take on a different kind of diphthong form, what we call an improper one. And notice as we work throughout this, the alpha coming across, when the alpha is long, coming across the iota, goes to what we call an alpha iota subscript. All right, see the little tail underneath that alpha? That is the iota subscript itself. That shows that there is a presence of an iota, thus it is a diphthong, but because the alpha is long, okay, it's an improper one. The same thing can happen with the eta as well as with the omega when it is formed together with the iota. Instead of the iota forming a second letter, it is subscripted below that long vowel. All right, so you'll see these throughout the Greek New Testament, and so you'll want to know what that little tail is underneath these. These are improper diphthongs. Now, in addition, notice that when we're talking about the improper diphthongs, that the iota does not affect the pronunciation whatsoever. It's simply a marker that when you see it, you can identify what it is and identify it accordingly. Now, as we move along, talking more about this business of vowels and diphthongs, let's look at a couple of things here. When you're working with the Greek text, you're going to find that there are words that begin with a vowel or a diphthong. And whenever a word begins with a vowel or a diphthong, it takes a particular breathing mark. Okay, you'll read about this in black. I just wanted to touch on it briefly here. As we look at these breathing marks, this is what it looks like. The first thing that you may come across when a word begins in a vowel or a diphthong is what's called a smooth breathing mark or a smooth breather. It looks in your Greek New Testament like an apostrophe. All right, notice that you have the word there, aiteo. All right, aiteo begins with a vowel, particularly a diphthong, and therefore a word with a vowel or diphthong at the beginning must have a breathing mark. Here, a smooth breathing one. Okay, aiteo. Notice that the smooth breathing mark really doesn't make a difference in terms of pronunciation. That's different, though, than some words that begin with a vowel or diphthong that have a rough breathing mark. Here, in terms of identification, it looks like an apostrophe turned around, if you will. A backwards apostrophe. Notice the word that we're working with here is ieron. Okay, ieron beginning with a vowel in this case. The rough breathing mark, though, is significant in terms of pronunciation. Whenever a word has a rough breathing mark at the beginning, you have to put an H sound in front of the word itself. And so going back to the PowerPoint, notice what we have here. It's not simply ieron. Yeah, with the rough breather, it's a heh sound. He-aaron. Okay? So you'll come across these in the Greek text, and when you're pronouncing words, you'll want to pay attention to whether this word that begins in a vowel or diphthong, whether it has a smooth breathing mark or a rough breathing mark. Doesn't matter with pronunciation with the smooth breathing mark, but with the rough breathing mark, it does. You put an H sound before it. Note also that the rho and the upsilon, whenever they're beginning a word, regularly have that rough breathing mark. Okay? They regularly have that rough breathing mark. So if you're looking at a word in the Greek text that begins with a rho or an upsilon, it won't always have that rough breather, but most likely it will. Okay? And so make sure you put the H sound into its pronunciation. Now, moving along here, just some additional facts as we walk through this process. Breathing marks and accents, when you see them in the Greek text itself, are written before the capital letters. Now, as I'll mention here in just a moment, the original text, when these texts in the New Testament were first written, there were no breathing marks, there were no accents, there was no pronunciation. All right, these are all in standard, up-to-date copies of the text as we have them today. But since you're reading out of the modern versions, they do incorporate breathing marks, accents, and punctuation. When you're working with the breathing marks and the accent marks themselves, and you've got a word that begins in a capital letter, normally with a lowercase letter, that accent mark or that breathing mark will simply go right over that lowercase letter. It can't do that because of typing issues in the capital letter. So whenever you see a breathing mark or an accent with a capital letter, it'll fall directly to the left of that capital letter. Let's look at the PowerPoint once again, and it will illustrate this very point. Notice audace. All right. Now, I want you to look at audace. Notice before that you've got what? A smooth breather or a rough breather? Well, if you're identifying it correctly, you're going to see that that's actually a rough breather. So it's not audace, it's hades, the word for Hades. Okay? Notice the next one, Adam. Smooth breather or rough breather? All right, that's going to be a smooth breather, and therefore Adam, the word for Adam, is the proper pronunciation. What about the last one there, beginning with the omega? Smooth breather or rough breather? It's going to be a rough breather, so not Hosanna, Hosanna. And you understand what that corresponds to as well. All of this simply to illustrate that when you're working with capital letters, the breathing marks or the accents that we're going to look at in just a moment will come directly to the left. Okay? So that'll give you a visual feel as you walk throughout that. Another thing that you'll find in the Greek text is what we call a diaeresis. All right, a diaeresis is just a double dot, if you will, that stands above the letter. And you'll see a diaeresis over vowels and diphthongs. Particularly, it's placed over the second vowel of what would normally be a diphthong. Those 7 diphthongs that we talked about. Whenever you see a diaeresis over the second letter of what you would normally identify as a diphthong, the diaeresis is there to show you that it's not functioning as a diphthong. So as we go back to the PowerPoint, you'll see you're accustomed with this particular word, with the alpha iota diphthong, to form one sound. Well, the diaeresis above it points you to the fact that actually it wants you to pronounce those 2 vowels separately, not as a diphthong, but as separate letters. And so notice here the word for Isaiah, Azaios. Azaios. All right, notice how I took what was normally a diphthong and I pronounced each letter of that. The diaeresis tells you that, and therefore when you see a diaeresis, pronounce appropriately. It's similar to the word naive in English. Naive, AI, is normally a diphthong in English, but here it's not functioning as a diphthong. Naive is how we would pronounce it. The diaeresis in the Greek text will point you to those kinds of situations. Another additional fact is not all vowels placed side by side are diphthongs. And these vowel combos, even without a diaeresis, should be pronounced with a respective syllable. Okay? This is what I'm talking about here. There are 3 of these examples. Notice the eta and the upsilon. All right, the eta and the upsilon do not form. They're 2 vowels, but they don't form a diphthong in Greek. All right, it's not one of the 7 that we looked at. So make sure you pronounce them separately. Eu for the eta upsilon. How about the iota epsilon? All right, not one of the 7 diphthongs, so you'll want to pronounce them separately. E for the iota epsilon form there. And then the iota eta. Notice here, E A. All right, 2 separate pronunciations here for each letter, because these are not diphthongs. And so when you see these combinations together, pronounce them appropriately. All right, let me just touch on accents. When we're working with accents, I'm not going to expect a great deal from you except to be able to recognize them. Okay? As you see on the screen there are 3 specific accents in Greek: the acute, the grave, and the circumflex. All right, the acute, as you see on the screen, is just a particular mark going from the top right to the bottom left. Okay? The grav is just the opposite, moving from the top left to the bottom right. And all of these come over either a lowercase letter or to the left of an uppercase letter. The circumflex, you can see there, comes over letters as well, and it's simply almost a half moon, if you will, that sits over a particular vowel in a particular Greek word. Now, you can spend many, many years learning how accents function, but that's not going to be a particular emphasis in this course. Being able to recognize and differentiate, though, between an acute, a grav, or a circumflex is something that you will be expected to do. But when it comes to learning them, if you're going to spend time in Greek or you're going to teach Greek, you'll want to spend the time learning how accents function. But at least at this basic level, I have to agree with C.K. Chesterton, who said this about Greek, and he was a Greek scholar himself. He says, "As for the Greek accents, I triumphantly succeeded through a long series of school terms in avoiding learning them at all. I never had a higher moment of gratification than when I afterwards discovered that the Greeks never learned them either. I felt with a radiant pride that I was as ignorant as Plato as well as Thucydides." And so here, since accents really weren't a part of the original text, we're not going to really focus on them in this class. Although Black will come back in a particular chapter to outline some of the most important things as you're beginning to understand how they do function at some time in the future. All right, and that leads us to talk a little bit about Greek punctuation. Greek punctuation was not a part of the original text. As a matter of fact, as we move to the Elmo here, you'll see an actual copy of an early Greek text. This is the one that we call P75. And you'll notice that you just, for the most part, have letters side by side, no spaces, no punctuation, and most of these letters primarily of the lowercase form, all right, in a column kind of format. This is the way the early Greek manuscripts read. Okay? And so when we begin to talk about issues of accent marks and we talk about issues of punctuation, I'm not giving them to you to suggest that they were a part of the original manuscripts themselves, but like punctuation, they did begin to move into the Greek text as we now have it as early as the 6th to the 9th centuries AD. And of course, they're a part of our most recent reconstructions of the text as well. And so because you're reading out of a current reconstruction of the text, well, you need to know what these particular critical marks are all about. The punctuation in the Greek text is very simple. Some of them corresponds well just to English, some of them don't. So let's look at these on the PowerPoint. A comma in English will correspond to a comma in Greek. So when you're reading in the Greek text and you see a comma, it functions just like a comma in the English text. A period in English is a period in Greek. So when you see a period in your Greek text, it's going to function just the same way that the period did in your English text. These last two are a little bit different. A semicolon in English, and when we use that, is designated by a period above the line in the Greek. So when you're reading in the Greek and you come to a period above the line, it's going to function more like stopping for a moment to deal with, to actually function as a semicolon would do so in the English process. And that's true also for the question mark in English. No question marks like we're accustomed to in the Greek text. The way the Greek text shows that we're dealing with a question is by using a semicolon. Okay? So the last two are a little bit different than we're accustomed to, and so you want to put a little bit more effort into making sure you put a mental note in regard to those two things. Okay? And so that's what we're talking about in terms of Greek punctuation. I want to turn now to talk a little bit about the issue of rules for pronunciation, because it's important as we deal with the rules of pronunciation to work with these well. I'm going to expect you to pronunciate, and so when we're talking either on the phone or when we're talking via Skype over the course of the term, I'm going to want to hear some good pronunciation, and I'm going to give you some pronunciation helps as it goes throughout. I want to just touch on some basic rules, and you actually have a copy of this as a part of your syllabus packet. Okay, so you'll want to turn to that page, the first page of the handouts of your syllabus packet for the pronunciation rules. And because you have it before you, I'm going to move through rather quickly in terms of pronunciation. Number one, when you're pronouncing a particular word in Greek, all right, there's going to be one vowel per syllable. All right, one vowel or diphthong per syllable. Notice the example here. I'm breaking this into its syllables. Akekamen, all right, goes from a, ke, ka, a, men. Simply dividing that out so that there's one vowel or diphthong per syllable enables you to break this up in syllables and pronounce it correctly. Notice the next one. Marturumen, marturumen. All right, I did that simply by putting one vowel per syllable. Okay, that's the first rule. The second rule that we'll look at here is that a single consonant by itself will go with the following vowel. So when you're dividing out these syllables and you're putting one vowel per syllable, what about the consonants that come in between? How do we break them up into pronounceable kinds of units? Well, let's look at an example of this. He'orakamen, as well as etheasametha. As we're working with these, notice I'm going to break them out according to vowels. All right. But when we're working with the consonants, I'm going to allow a single consonant to go with the following vowel. So, he-o-ra-ka-men. Okay? He-o-ra-ka-men. For the second word, ethe-a-sa-metha. Okay? In this sense, the single consonant by itself goes with the following vowel. All right, the third rule is this one. Very simple and straightforward. When you have two consecutive vowels which do not form a diphthong, you're going to want to divide these. Now, I've already suggested that this was the case. Notice that the second one has the diaeresis, which definitely points you to this, but you don't always have the diaeresis. Notice in the first word, you've got the epsilon and the alpha, okay? This does not form a diphthong, and therefore you want to separate the two. Ethe-asa-metha. The second one does have the diaeresis, and it shows you what would normally be an alpha iota diphthong, separated. Eza-ias. Okay? The next rule, a cluster that does not begin a word is divided, and the first consonant will go with the preceding vowel. Let's look at these two examples, in prosthen as well as our case. All right, as we're breaking these up into syllables, okay, we're talking about a cluster of consonants that does not begin a word is divided. So notice you got a cluster in the first example here, the mu and the p as well as the rho. All right, and so we're going to divide those. M for the first syllable, pros for the second syllable, then for the third. Now you might want to ask the question, well, why didn't you separate the p and the rho in the second syllable? Well, the reason for that is that the p and the rho come together in Greek to pronounce a PR sound similar to what you have in English. And so those form actually one sound and thus one syllable. The second one, our case, you've got a rho and a key. Separate those two. Our case for its pronunciation. Now, the next one here, a consonant cluster that can begin a word, goes with the following vowel. Looking at this, notice we have the word for Christos as well as graphe. All right, if you've got a consonant cluster that can begin a word, it goes with the following vowel. The kappa and the rho, taking on that first vowel, making the first syllable. Christos. Graphe, once again, the gamma and the rho coming together to make one sound, coupled with that vowel following it, one syllable here. Graphe. Okay? And then here, double consonants are divided. Notice as we walk throughout this particular example, in the first word, apangelamen, you've got a double lambda. All right, well, you're going to separate those two. They're double consonants, if you will. So, apangelamen is the way we would work those out in terms of syllabification. Paresia is the second example. Notice you've got two rows. Separate them. Paresia. Okay? Now, another rule as we work with pronunciation, any consonant plus a mu or a nu goes with the following vowel. Okay, let's look at these examples. Ethnesen as well as pneuma. Okay? Notice that both of these words have a combination that has either a mu or a nu following another consonant. In the first one, the theta and the nu. In the second one, the p and the nu. You want to separate those things. And the second one goes with the next vowel. All right? ethnesin. All right, ethnesin. For pneuma, pneuma. Okay? And then as we work throughout the last one here, compound words are divided where they're joined. You'll notice that Greek, when they're dealing with words, can put prepositions on the front of them. And when they do so, it makes what we call a compound word. Okay, the first one here, antichristos. All right, you'll want to separate those out. One word on one side, the other word on the other. Antichristos. All right. Same for ekbalo, bringing together the preposition ek as well as the verb balo. Well, let's separate those two. Ekbalo, as you're then going about the process of breaking these things into syllables. All right. Now, as we finish out this particular segment, I want to do so by pronouncing 1 John with you because it's a part of your homework assignment for this particular module. But I want to make sure that you have worked through, okay, the pronunciation of 1 John 1 through 5 before I actually work it through. So if you haven't yet worked through it, I want you to stop this process right now and then come back to it once you've had an opportunity to work through 1 through 5, to break 1 through 5 into syllables, and to try on your own to actually pronounce them. Then come back and listen to my pronunciation, and we'll work from that angle. And so if you need to pause right now, let me encourage you to do so, because I'm going to move on to do the pronunciation here when it resumes. Okay? So you'll want to pause it here. All right. All right, as we come back, let me actually break this down. You can see on the screen how I have broken this down in terms of syllabification. And you also have a copy of this PowerPoint before you, I would assume. Let me talk about, as I go through this, according to the rules that we just set forth, let me pronounce this for you. Okay? It goes en, arche, ein, halagos, kai, halagos, ein, proston, theon, kai, theos, ein, halagos. Hutos, ein, enarche, proston, theon. Panta di autou, agenata, kai, choris autou, agenata, udehen. Ha geganen, in auto zoe ein, kai, he zoe, ein taphos ton anthropon. Kai taphos inte scatia fine, kai he scatia alta u catelaben. Okay? All right. Well, that ought to do it for this particular segment, and it ought to also do it for helping you get along the way as you begin to put the Greek alphabet together in good pronunciation, but also in the ability to pronounce these words with proper syllabification. And so I hope it has been helpful to you. See you back in the next segment.